Welcome to this fireside chat. I am Erik Borra and I am joined by Bernard Rieder and Stijn Peeters. All three of us work as assistant or associate professors at the Media Studies Department of the University of Amsterdam. Apart from being humanities scholars, we also write software for research. Our most well-known tools include DMI-TCAT, which allows one to gather and analyze Twitter data, the YouTube data tools for gathering and analyzing YouTube data, 4CAT for the retrieval and analysis of more fringe media such as 4chan, Reddit, or BitChute, and the now defunct Netvizz application, which allowed one to query Facebook's Open Graph. Today's talk will focus on why we make such tools and the principles we adhere to when making them, as well as future challenges. But let me first explain why humanities scholars would even think about writing software for studying online platforms. So in the past 10 to 20 years, a lot of social and cultural activity has moved on to these platforms. With staggering user numbers and a plethora of contemporary issues, such as activism, fake news and disinformation, or even deplatforming, it has become clear that such platforms should be scrutinized, also from a humanities perspective. These platforms, however, are operated by private companies and are thus black boxed and opaque. And without inside access, it is very hard to know what happens on or through these platforms. We thus need a way to get to this data differently. And that is exactly why we made these tools.
So one thing that we do need to be aware of when making these tools, but also just when working with them, is that they will always mediate the research that is being done with them. And they do that directly because they give us the data that we work with, but they also influence it and mediate it less directly. For example, by shaping the very questions that we ask to begin with, since those questions will often follow what is, but also what is not possible with the tools that we have at our disposal. And today, much of the work in this area is done in research software engineering for the more computational fields. And as humanities scholars, which we are, our goals are often somewhat different from theirs. For example, whereas a computationally oriented scientist may be looking to generalize a particular data set into an abstract model to then make predictions with, in social science and humanities, our approach is often more oriented towards rich descriptions and then the subsequent interpretive analysis of those descriptions and the data it comes from. And that leads to different kinds of research questions, but also different approaches to answer those research questions. And then finally, that has repercussions for how we build the tools that give us those answers. So in our field particularly, which is media studies, we often analyze the objects of our research from a material perspective. So technologies and data platforms all have their own specificities, and those specificities inform research, or they can even be the focus of the research. And to that end, for example, we do not only use APIs to acquire the data with, but these APIs can become objects of research in themselves. And the objects produced through these APIs, so tweets, videos, posts, they all have their specific attributes and they're ranked in specific ways. And that can be studied to make sense of those objects, but it can also be done to analyze and critique the APIs and the materialities that produce them. And that approach requires a certain, let's say, epistemological flexibility, where rather than having one paradigmatic method that can be implemented in one software tool and then reused in different projects, we like to say that we follow the medium and we can adjust the approach to the materiality of the data that we're working with. In that sense, well, to some extent, we can actually build a method into a tool. In practice, we often work with what we call recipes. So those are series of analytical steps which involve the use of tools in some cases, but other steps require interpretation on the part of the researcher based on the data produced by these tools in previous steps, and that we can then use that to make an informed choice about what to do next. And these recipes are often correspond roughly to a canonical research method, but at the same time, this approach that leaves the researcher room to adjust their project when that's needed. And something like that is harder if a method is implemented in research software directly. There's one explicit analytical pathway. So what does that look like in practice in our work? One thing that characterizes our approach is that it's often very modular, in that rather than one monolithic tool, we have a variety of smaller analytical tools and modules, sometimes very simple, that can be combined in different ways. And of course, that requires that each of these steps and each of these smaller tools that you can mix and match, that all of them produce reliable and reproducible results. Because when you chain tools like this, the result is only as strong as the weakest link. So to that end, making our work open source is quite important, but just making the source code available only helps people that can actually read the source code. While many of the users of these tools are precisely the scholars who don't know how to program because we're in the humanities. And that is why next to just putting the code on GitHub, annotation and documentation of the code should also be part of open sourcing research software. So making it clear to a user what the code will do in human language, and providing references to documentation of the API or system that it interacts with, referencing a relevant technique if it's also written up elsewhere in scholarly writing, and providing these recipes that show in what context the chosen software makes sense and what kind of data it can but also cannot be used for.
Yeah, and I mean, we've been working on these principles and strategies already for quite a while, but there's also a number of contemporary issues that we're facing, and I just want to highlight 3 of them that have become particularly relevant for us in recent years. Maybe the most important one is the changing relationship and changing to more complications with large platform companies and their web APIs. Particularly after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, API access has become more precarious. Axel Bruns calls this the API collapse. And this includes APIs that simply close, right? So for example, Netvizz was a victim of Facebook closing down API access, but this can also mean account suspensions or API key suspensions. At the same time, new possibilities are opening up. For example, the Social Science One initiative in the US, where the Social Science Research Council brokered data access for Facebook data, or for example, the specific track for researchers in Twitter's new API. But these new possibilities also have new bureaucratic requirements, and they cannot easily replace the kind of data that we've been getting through APIs. And indeed, in these kind of contexts, our tools also may have to be adapted. There's also a renewed debate around scraping, right? Which basically means instead of grabbing data through an API, is to load the HTML interface content and then directly parse it. But around scraping, there are also quite important questions about the legality, about the ethics, and even around the practicality of scraping. There are, bot protection measures in place, and so there are, questions that remain to be solved. And in some cases, they may not be solvable in the sense that researchers may actually be unable to publish results based on such a method. A second set of concerns concern privacy and legal compliance. And here the GDPR is particularly important. It does provide some leeway to researchers. So there are, some exceptions within the GDPR that actually, allow us to go maybe a bit further than a marketing company would. But there are also new requirements. For example, the capacity to remove users, specific users, easily from existing data sets. At the same time, academic guidelines are also changing, and there are new requirements that come, through institutional ethics boards and other bodies, and that may be, for example, that scholars have to secure access to these data to really make sure that nobody can gain access to it, or there may be obligations to archive data sets. And for us, the question in this context is, of course, how to react to these challenges in the design of our tools, right? So we're thinking about things like deletion interfaces, about encryption of data, also maybe even about automatic upload to services like Figshare. And the third point, the last set of challenges or concerns is that the web itself has been changing over recent years, and the status of web data changes with it. So, for example, platforms, as we all know, have been deplatforming users. They've been deleting posts. They've been withholding certain data. And in some cases, platforms may simply disappear entirely, right? So just 1 week after Stijn implemented an import module into ForCat for Parler simply disappeared. Now it's back again, right? But these are examples for the kind of precarity that we are facing. And these phenomena, first of all, we have to understand them before we can even react to them, right? Within our tools, and then possibly also translate these issues so that our users can also react to them. And with the web overall becoming more dynamic, the question of scheduling, for example, is becoming really important, right? So when was specific data retrieved? We're no longer in this situation where we can simply say, we use an API to gain access to some static database that is only growing and nothing else, right? So that's another vector of questions that we have to deal with. And these are just some of the recent issues that we've been facing. And indeed, they do require additional work and potentially also additional skills that a group of research engineers may or may not have.
So with this fireside chat, we introduced why, as humanities scholars, we write software and how we do so. And then we addressed some of the new challenges that are popping up. And concluding, we'd like to argue that the role of the research engineer, or the role of the research engineer, should be expanded. Programming is just one part of research, and that needs to have an intricate connection with methodology and users. So as research software engineers, we need to have one foot in research, one foot in software, but also one foot in education and one foot in strategic planning. And we are fortunate enough to have received a Dutch grant from the Platform Digital Infrastructure for Social Science and Humanities to start addressing these issues. And the project is called CAT4SMR, which is an acronym for Capture and Analysis Tools for Social Media Research. And it gives us 5 years to work on these issues and to acquire these new skills of lobbying for access, etc. And we, if you're interested in this project, please go to cat4smr.humanities.uva.nl, where our tools are listed, as well as our social media presence, and where you can get in touch with us to further discuss this. And we warmly invite you to approach us if you're also struggling with some of these issues, such as lobbying for access, adapting to changing infrastructures and requirements, like whether it be maintenance, legal issues, workloads, financing, citation, or even sharing of data. Do not hesitate to get in touch with us. And rather than glossing over such things, we suggest to make them actually part and parcel of future research projects, and to thus not forget to write them into our research proposal. Thanks for your attention, and we're very happy to further discuss this with you in the following Q&A session.